Apocalypse, the misunderstanding of Revelation. Apocalypse, certainly not the most amusing of words. Generally, it is used improperly to define a catastrophic end-of-the-world event. It recently made a comeback in the fateful 2020, taking everyone by surprise and making most people aware of the importance of a remote Chinese location with an exotic name, Wuhan. One might say fear in the form of a contagion shortly after or shortly thereafter the SARS. I'm just going to say the C word because I've actually had videos deleted for talking about it. They've deleted and censored my channel. They put strikes on my channel a lot. So whenever I just say the C word, you know what I'm referring to. So shortly thereafter, the C word would become the new unchallenged dominus of the planetary scene, or dominus of the planetary scene, with millions of people locked down in their homes, an epidemic of uncertain origins. Not that it appeared, at least at the beginning, to be truly a global threat. At the dawn of the new year, it seemed that the world had something entirely different to worry about. On January 3rd, the front pages reported a traumatic event, the killing of a high-ranking official of the Tehran regime in Baghdad, General Qasem Soleimani. Who was he? A controversial character to be sure, but one of the highest order, and a leading figure in the unstable theater of the Middle East, which for some time now has been bloodied by the ISIS cutthroats. Gangs of assassins who seem to have sprung out of nowhere with merciless orders, invade territories, sow terror, and kill everyone. In other words, the demand for total submission of a fanatical kind under the pretext of exclusive religious affiliation. Corollary, all Christian churches were to be destroyed along with all places of worship that were not strictly Islamic, or more specifically, not strictly Sunni. Incidentally, Biglino ironically points out that ISIS itself could be seen as a perfect example of an executor of the orders of Yahweh, mass extermination and the destruction of other people's altars. The all too familiar biblical script. Remember in the Old Testament, I think I read some of it and posted it in some of the stories on my channel and my Instagram, how the Yahweh God of the Old Testament was literally just ordering everyone to kill off the other tribes and rape people and take all their belongings and burn it in the courtyards of their cities and take their women and turn them into slaves. In those early days of January following Soleimani's strange death, bright flashes lit up in the sky. Retaliatory missiles launched by Iran against what were essentially symbolic targets. One of the missiles even shot down a civilian aircraft, and the shock that followed the disaster put an end in just a few hours. Or in just a few hours to what had seemed to be the beginning of a nightmarish spiral of events. Who was Soleimani? Let me try that name again. It's Soleimani, I think is how you say it. He was certainly hardcore, the leader of Iran's special forces, which had just shown their worth in Syria against the ISIS militiamen. He had been killed in the Middle East in the night of the Iraqi capital. It is believed that he was about to encourage some important diplomatic negotiations in those ancient Sumerian lands torn apart by disputes between the Shiites and the Sunnis amid the great chaos that had broken out of the aftermath of the most recent American wars. Those conflicts had been festering against the backdrop of the traditional hostility of the Arab nations towards Israel. They ended with the death sentence of Saddam Hussein, the ferocious dictator who had long been armed by the West and finally accused of possessing weapons of mass destruction, which later proved non-existent. In 2020, fueled once more by the inscrutability of the Middle Eastern puzzle, seemed destined to write yet another page of this infinite war based on the most classic of scripts. We saw the convention between Arabs and Israelis. In parentheses, it says, note that both are Semites and descendants of Abraham, with the West and Russia on alert. And now, let's not forget China, still in the background, but getting closer and closer to center stage thanks to its exuberant commercial power, which has now spread throughout the great raw materials reserve known as Africa. What about the apocalypse? The misunderstanding would have been cleared up in a matter of months. The missiles of 2020, the real ones, would not have been of the conventional ballistic type. Now, we've begun to call it by its name, the Great Reset, a universal reconfiguration involving political, social, and healthcare systems, but also economic, financial, physiological, and even anthropological in nature. Mauro Baglino has got his audience accustomed to keeping a safe distance from current events and their possible interpretation. Wisdom? I deal with the Bible. I'm happy to speak about that, but nothing else, because I don't like to talk publicly about things I don't know equally well. Historians admit it openly. Those who study the past are not necessarily better able to understand the present, let alone predict the future. For this part, Baglino opens a new frontier of investigation. True knowledge of the past in its utter concreteness may prove to be fundamental. It can reveal precise cultural and financial realities that still affect the masses today. Not surprisingly, he adds, systems of power tend to exercise tight control over our knowledge about the past. It's curious. A historian is willing to change his or her mind if documents emerge that contradict some previously established historiographical notions. Those who transform the Bible into a text upon which to base their faith, however, consider it infallible. Fine, but have they read it? Have they carefully examined what it says? Simply put, the Bible in many aspects is just a photocopy of the Sumerian Akkadian origin stories, the classics, the Atrahasis, Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh. We've been talking about that for quite a while on this channel. The birth of our species, the Great Flood, and other stories were already all contained in those texts, which the biblical writers would certainly have read. The absurd thing is that, while the Bible is claimed to be an expression of the sort of historical truth inspired by God, the Sumerian texts, which are the original, are thought to be nothing more than fables, just myths and legends. But the real surprise is something else altogether. If we clear the field for just a moment, setting aside the theological reading of the Old Testament, the one God, almighty creator of heaven and earth, is it possible that the Bible does in fact recount historical truth? It's certainly a relevant question. At least pretend that it might be so. For one fundamental reason, the Bible account, as I said, is coherent. Of course, it often appears to us as sour, shocking, and difficult to digest at times, but it is perfectly logical and an credible account. We are talking essentially about a war story describing terrifying confrontations, fractal wars, conflicts among relatives. Yahweh regularly commands his people belonging to him, the sons of Jacob and Israel, to exterminate their adversaries. They all share the same blood. They are neighbors, direct descendants of Abraham, and in many cases of his family origin. In a word, they are cousins, and Yahweh's provisions are cruel. Take no prisoners, kill everyone, neither more nor less than ISIS did. The terrorists of the so-called this is asking a question. The terrorists of the so-called Islamic State? I know the comparison can be off-putting, but this is exactly what is written in the Bible. and with an infinite, staggeringly detailed abundance of elements that are horrific, unacceptable, and abominable to us. For example, spare no one, neither the elderly nor the women, sometimes with one exception, little girls. It was enough for them to be 3 years old, to be precise, 3 years and a day, to be considered sexually attractive. Horrifying. One might say that is a simple question of customs. There is nothing more unstable, after all, than ethics. The moral compass can change in radical ways across the ages. Might it not simply have been considered normal in those days to have sexual relations with toddlers? Marabuglino sighs. The subject is just so controversial that he felt he had to dedicate an entire chapter to it in this book, The False Testament. And it's still going on today with all the people in government that are pedos and doing the child trafficking and all that stuff. Those pages are so unsettling that they are never read publicly. But they are not the only ones. The entire textual, literal reading of the Old Testament reveals a completely different story from what we have always been told in the religious context. And yet, that is precisely what the book says. What is written in it? I certainly did not discover it. I want to reiterate that I haven't, quote-unquote, discovered anything at all. Buglino's Apocalypse is certainly a strange one. From the Greek from the Greek word is apocalypsis, revelation. The translator shakes his head and smiles, as if to say, come on, let's be serious here. Which revelation are we talking about? The truth, which he brought to light for the benefit of the general public, has never been either secret or mysterious. I'll say it again. It is enough to just read the Bible to understand what it actually says. Of course, Hebrew keeps us from being misled by improper translations. But reading it in English or any other contemporary language still permits us to have a very precise idea of the events narrated in the Old Testament. Authentic stories? Again, we don't know. In some cases, there are confirmations from chronological comparisons that can be cross-referenced with historical sources more often than not, though we can only rely on the Bible authors who, unfortunately, are still unknown to us. What happens if we pretend that the writing in the Bible is the literal truth? Simple. You realize that it's a set of books recount something very precise, the appearance of superior, non-human beings who genetically manufactured Homo sapiens. And that there were many of them, and they were technologically advanced. Extraterrestrials? Impossible to say. The Bible does not specify that. At most, we can define them as quote-unquote aliens. But in a more strictly technical sense of the word, namely individuals who are different and distinct from us. At one point, the discussion focuses on just one of them, Yahweh. Exactly. The biblical texts describe him with these words, male and warrior. And what does he care about? Not the whole of humanity, but only about his people. And these people are not even the Jews as a whole, but merely a part of them. As mentioned before, the descendants of Jacob and Israel. It is to them that this Yahweh warrior character makes a solemn promise. He would give them a vast dominion which would extend from the Nile to the Euphrates Valley and even beyond. The map of Greater Israel, sometimes displayed with some satisfaction by the Tel Aviv military, even in recent times, including not only the whole of Palestine and all of Jordan, but also a large part of Syria, the southern tip of Turkey, and a slice of Saudi Arabia. The so-called Eretz Israel also includes a large portion of Iraq, plus the Sinai and the eastern belt of Egypt, or the Nile Valley and the Red Sea. A few thousand years have passed since then, assuming that Yahweh really existed and that he led the Israelites into continuous little wars of conquest. Do you think he has managed to keep his promise? Sinai, Golan, the West Bank. These are the only incursions since 1948. The 20th century is a tormented one, probably reaching its peak on the one occasion when hope for a great reconciliation on the banks of the Jordan seemed to be at hand. In 1993, Israelis and Palestinians decided for the first time on mutual recognition, and each party admitted the other's right to exist. The Israeli hero and protagonist of the historical agreement, Yitzhak Rabin, who was later awarded a Nobel Prize shortly thereafter, he was assassinated by an Israel extremist settler. What is striking to us beyond the biblical promises regarding the coveted greater Israel is the firm determination of the small Jewish state that arose after the Second World War in wake of universal horror of Shoah. It is a fact only after Auschwitz where the Jews granted the historical right to a state. This could also lead to some disturbing questions, especially considering some recent historical research investigating the loans that Hitler himself would have received from certain discreet overseas bankers. If I were Jewish, I would first of all concern myself with understanding why, already at the end of the 19th century and into the earliest 20th century, a great Anglo-Saxon newspaper repeatedly wrote that 6 million Jews were about to be killed in Europe. At the time, Hitler was still going to kindergarten. Mauro Buglino is well aware that he is treading on tricky terrain here. Let me be very, very clear on this point. I am not remotely questioning the fact of what happened in the appalling extermination perpetuated in the Nazi concentration camps. What I'm asking myself, if anything, is how that obsessive prophecy come to be in the press. The prophecy about such a precise number of future victims. 6 million. Even the New York Times talked about it on November 6, 1900. Jewish sources write that in Leviticus, the word that means you shall return is missing, a letter. And in parentheses it says VAV, which has a numerical value of 6. The absence of this letter would therefore mean that 6 million Jews were not to be able to return to Israel. Mauro Buglino does not believe at all in biblical prophecies. The Old Testament, the prophecies are all made ex post facto. Without exception, the prophesied events in reality had already occurred. In this case, the gematria, the ancient discipline that assigns a precise numerical value to each Hebrew letter, also stood in support of the prophecy regarding the most extensive massacre of the 20th century. Some argue, in fact, that based on this count, the Bible even contains the exact date, the return of Israel, 1948, and this only after the death of the unfortunate 6 million Jews. According to the same sources, this is also mentioned in the Sefer HaZohar, the Book of Zohar, also known as the Book of Splendor. This is a Kabbalistic volume of medieval times composed in Spain by Sephardic Jews. Although it only appears towards the end of the 12th century, it was written in a contrived literary Aramaic notes, according to Wikipedia. Did the authors want to seem like a text dating back some several centuries? The Zohar is still very much a topic of discussion. For some, it is utter nonsense. For others, it contains ancient wisdom. Incidentally, Mauro Buglino has an excellent relationship with the Jewish community. The recently deceased great Kabbalist Rabbi Ari Ben Nun even wanted to help popularize his book in the United States. According to Ari Ben Nun, life was packaged like a preserve and brought to Earth. From where? From another galaxy. from a planet illuminated by a great or a bright cold star. Is this what this most learned rabbi really thought? Of course, and that's no surprise, Biglino finds himself quite at home in the Jewish cultural milieu. It's a world of extraordinary openness. In Judaism, there is room for everyone. It runs from absolute orthodoxy to pure atheism. In rabbinic schools, people are taught not to trust any single source. Once a second one is found, you are encouraged to find a third, precisely to encourage doubt and refutation. It is no coincidence that Biglino often cites the Talmud, where this technique is widely applied. In other words, never take anything for granted. This is exactly the opposite of what has always been done with the Bible in the Christian tradition. Dogma intervenes, preventing the development of deeper knowledge and understanding. Dogma, or a category of mystery, simply does not exist in the Bible. This is how it works. Something gets translated incorrectly, making it necessary to introduce the idea of mystery. It reflects attempts to help the whole story hang together properly after having presented the Bible as saying things that, in fact, it had never said. Is that the big issue? Clearly, the theological interpretation of the book, which is based on traditions that are erroneous or even completely fabricated, serves as the foundation for all the world's great monotheistic religions, which in turn form the basis of the power structures that still govern the world today. Does this apply to everything? Consider those 6 million victims of the Shoah. If I were Jewish, those predictions in the newspapers would keep me awake all night. Are these elusive powers, conjectures, conspiracies, or secret plans? Mauro Biglino essentially focuses on the role, in his opinion, an improper one, that has been attributed to the Bible as source of power. His patient work exemplifies the fact that everything can be reread in another way, textually, without any theoretical reminiscence. Let me emphasize that the Old Testament is a beautiful book as long as it is read honestly, as it is actually written. Literal analysis is not the only option to a theological reading. There are many other possible readings. Symbolical, esoteric, geometric, Kabbalistic. All of them are legitimate. All of them are interesting, provided that we do not presume to exclude a textual, literal reading, which is precisely what they don't want me to do. Is that upsetting? Naturally, because it dismantles from the outset the very idea that God, assuming he exists, has anything at all to do with this book. Over 10 years of intense intellectual battles, Mauro Biglino has had to defend his work with the utmost commitment. I have never claimed to be certain that what the Bible says is true. My ideas are still only hypotheses. Very carefully argued, the documented ones, the Old Testament may contain truths and inventions, omissions, and exaggerations, just like so many other history books. What is unbearable, though, is the way we kept suggesting that when the Bible says one thing, it actually means another. The power of persuasion. We don't even know who wrote the Bible. It is not known when it was written, nor in what language. At the time of Moses, Hebrew did not even exist as a language. But we claim to know that when those pages express one concept, in reality they are talking about something else. It might sound crazy, but this is what generally happens. The Bible is continuously made to say what it does not say, what it has never said. The point is, the book has been used. it has been it has been used from the foundation of extremely earthly and material interests. Yeah, like domination and manipulation of human consciousness and population control. A curious destiny. Theology spiritualizes a text that has nothing spiritual about it, and then uses it improperly as a formidable instrument of domination. Is that the case? It certainly is, confirms the translator. And it has worked very well in this sense for over 2,000 years. But now seems the fragments of truth are gradually emerging. Could this be because we are perhaps approaching some sort of apocalypse? Speaking of that, I think it's time we dispel some of the beliefs that have generated a certain emphasis on the Apocalypse of John, the closing chapter of the Bible. It is commonly believed, in fact, to be a reference to the quote-unquote end of time. Is that not so? I'm afraid not. That book seems essentially directed to the earliest Christian communities. It is a political text with precise instructions on how to be aware of the adversary, or the adversary. That is to say, of Satan? Not at all. The enemy referred to seems to be Lucius Domitius and Norbarbus, or the Emperor Nero. A bit of background. The text attributed to the John Evangelist, written in Greek, probably at the end of the first century, has nothing in common with the extremely explicit realism of the Old Testament written in Hebrew. In the New Testament, compiled under the influence of the by then dominant Hellenic literary culture, the blatantly visionary aspects are dominant. The apocalypse seems to be a written text in code for the nascent Christian churches. The writing is encrypted, containing instructions and recommendations for defending themselves from the persecutions to which these early churches were subjected by the Roman emperors in particular. That is, for example, is what the infamous 666 refers to, the so-called number of the beast. The text describes it as a strange animal. It had 2 horns, similar to those of a lamb, but spoke like a dragon. It is a beast that works great wonders and thus seduces the inhabitants of earth. And then it ensures that everyone, young and old, rich and poor, freemen and slaves, shall receive a mark on the right hand of their forehead, and that no one will be able to buy or sell anything without such a mark, the name of the beast or the number of his name. Herein lies the wisdom, the text goes on. Elusively, whoever has intelligence must calculate the number of the beast. It is, in fact, a number of man, and his number is 666. Nero, then? Is Roman imperialism, both military and mercantile, the real target of this deliberately obscured writing? On Latin coins, Biglino explains the name Nero, of which 666 is the numerical transcription, is simply indicated as Nero. The number, however, presents some interesting features. In papyri, other than the one used for the preparation of the version of the Apocalypse that was officially included as canon, there are different numbers. In papyrus, number 115 by Osinicus, and elsewhere as well, the number 616 is found, and in yet other papyri, it is the number 665. And that's not all. Irenaeus of Lyons, who defined the canon of the New Testament, believed that this was an error of the copyist. In fact, though, the number might be derived from the Latin rereading of the number 666. While the expression Nero appears in Roman coins written in Latin, things change from the coins with the wording in Greek. There the emperor becomes Neron. The final N has a value of 50, the precise difference between 616 and 666, which would indicate that the number of the beast most likely does indeed refer to Nero. But let's not be hasty. there is a second possible interpretation. The number 616 could be the numerical transcription of the name Caligula, who was the emperor before Nero. Whatever the case, Nero or Caligula, the general sense would not change. In both instances, the number seems to refer to Roman emperors. And the Roman emperors considered to be the true enemies of the early Christianity. So no end of times then? Not at all. The Apocalypse of John seems to me to contain the messianic hopes of those times, when there was a sense of imminent advent and establishment of the new kingdom. Let me read that again. When there was a sense of the imminent advent and establishment of the new kingdom, where righteous would be saved, or where the righteous would be saved. Almost 2,000 years have passed at the time, though the new age was expected immediately, from one day to the next. Reread in such a way the word of chapter 7 of the Revelation have another effect altogether. A great multitude stood before a throne, and before the Lamb clothed with the robes, the psalms in their hands. The righteous dressed in white cried with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God, which sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb. Who are they, these righteous? Where did they come from? One of the elder replies to the writer of the text, These are they which came out of the great tribulation, and have washed their robes, and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore are they before the throne of God, and served him day and night in his temple. And he that sitteth on the throne shall dwell among them. These things are certain. They shall hunger no more, neither thirst any more, neither shall the sunlight on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb which is in the midst of the throne shall feed them, and shall lead them unto living fountains of water. And God shall wipe away all the tears from their eyes. In other words, their redemption draweth nigh. The readers of the Apocalypse were probably clamoring impatiently, says Biglino. The text was written specifically for them. The promise was that injustice would be erased from the world, and that this would be done immediately. Those messianic expectations were already expressed by Jesus, who presented them as imminent, indeed as already begun, like the establishment of the new kingdom. Luke in chapter 17 has him say, The kingdom of God is among you. The coming of the new kingdom would be established in the same generation. This is not how things went. Typical, after all, the same thing happened with the promise of greater Israel. All right, so that is the end of that section. More and more evidence that the Bible is just a massive psyop. Well, at least the King James Bible is a massive psyop. I call it a stand-down psyop. A stand-down psyop is a psychological kind of manipulation that creates passiveness in the population, or it causes potential people that may resist the New World Order to just sit back and not do anything because they believe that some third-party intermediary is going to come save them. You know, like the return of Jesus Christ. Donald Trump, make America great again. Nasara Jassara. Pleiadians are going to come and they're going to give us all this technology. I mean, there's so much stuff going around the truther community like this that it's very ridiculous. I think there's a high probability that it's all just a big stand-down psyop. The ultimate king of all stand-down psyops being the return of Jesus Christ.